Something is breaking inside the American war machine, and the Pentagon doesn't want you to know it. Right now, behind the closed doors of the most powerful military apparatus in human history, there is fracture. Not the kind you read about in sanitized press briefings or see dressed up in flag-waving cable news segments, but a deeper structural crack. Rumors of resistance within the US Navy are surfacing at the exact same moment Donald Trump's Iran war strategy is visibly collapsing under its own contradictions. And that is not a coincidence. That is capitalism in uniform eating itself alive. You see, empires don't fall from the outside first, they rot from within. When soldiers, sailors, officers, men and women trained to follow orders begin to question the legitimacy of those orders, history tells us something enormous is shifting. The last time institutional military resistance surfaced at this scale in American culture, Vietnam ended. Think about that. What you're watching right now is not just a foreign policy failure. It is a crisis of imperial authority. Let's go back to the beginning of this whole story because it didn't start with a headline. It started with a pattern, and patterns, my friends, are far more revealing than any single news cycle event. The pattern here is one that students of history will recognize immediately, and it is the pattern of an empire that has overextended itself, overestimated its power, and is now confronting the raw, ugly reality of its own limitations. And that confrontation is not happening in a boardroom, it is not happening in a Senate chamber, it is happening inside the hull of American warships, in the mess halls of aircraft carriers, in the private conversations of officers who swore an oath to defend a constitution, not to wage a war they believe is both illegal and suicidal. Now, when we talk about the Navy mutiny rumors, let's be precise about what we mean, because precision matters in a time when words get weaponized and distorted before they even finish echoing. We are not talking about sailors throwing their commanding officers overboard. We are not talking about a Hollywood-style coup on the high seas. What we are talking about is something far more consequential in the long run, a growing, spreading, deeply rooted culture of institutional resistance. Officers refusing to sign off on certain operational orders. Enlisted personnel raising formal objections through chain of command channels. Legal officers filing dissent memos, anonymous communications leaking to journalists. This is what institutional resistance looks like in the 21st century American military, and it is happening right now at a scale that the Pentagon's public affairs machine cannot fully suppress. And why is it happening? Because the people inside that institution, the ones who actually sail those ships, who actually run those operations, who actually understand the strategic and logistical realities of a potential conflict with Iran, those people know something that the cable news audience doesn't fully grasp yet. They know that a war with Iran is not a weekend expedition. It is not another asymmetrical conflict where American technological supremacy automatically translates into a quick, clean victory. Iran is not Iraq in 2003. Iran is not Libya. Iran is not Afghanistan. Iran is a country with a sophisticated, battle-hardened military, a deeply embedded missile defense architecture, a network of proxy forces stretched across the entire Middle East, and a geographic position that allows it to close the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. The people inside the Navy understand what closing that strait means. It means a global economic catastrophe. It means fuel prices in America that would make the 1970s oil shock look like a mild inconvenience. It means a war that does not stay contained to the Persian Gulf. So when we say that Trump's Iran war plan is crumbling, we have to understand that it was never a plan in the serious, strategic, long-term sense of the word. It was an impulse dressed up as a policy. It was the application of the same transactional reality television logic that has characterized this administration's entire approach to foreign policy. The assumption that aggression signals strength, that threats produce capitulation, that you can bully a nation of 85 million people with a deep civilizational identity and 1,000 years of experience surviving foreign pressure into simply folding and surrendering on your terms. That assumption is not just strategically naive, it is historically illiterate, and the military professionals inside the American Armed Forces know it. Think about what has actually happened over the past several months with this Iran policy. The administration came in with the maximalist pressure approach. Sanctions tightened to their absolute limit. Military posturing in the Gulf ramped up dramatically. Rhetoric from the White House escalating week after week. The theory was simple: squeeze Iran hard enough, and they will come crawling to the negotiating table and accept whatever terms Washington dictates. That was the theory. Now let's look at the reality. Iran's nuclear enrichment program has not slowed down, it has accelerated. Iran's regional proxy network has not weakened. It has actually expanded its operational capabilities in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. Iran's domestic political situation, far from collapsing under the weight of economic pressure, has actually seen the hardliners consolidate more power, because that is what external pressure always does to authoritarian systems. It gives them the justification they need to crack down internally and rally the population around a nationalist narrative of resistance against foreign aggression. This is not a surprising outcome. This is geopolitics 101. This is what every serious analyst predicted would happen, and it happened exactly as predicted. So now the administration is caught in a trap of its own making. You cannot indefinitely escalate threats without either following through on them or losing all credibility. And following through, actually launching military strikes against Iran, is something that even the hawkish elements inside the American security establishment are deeply, profoundly divided about. Because the question is never just, can we strike Iran? The question is always, and then what? What happens the morning after the first American bombs fall on Iranian soil? Does Iran simply absorb the blow and do nothing? Every serious military planner knows the answer to that question, and the answer is no. Iran retaliates. Iran retaliates asymmetrically through multiple vectors simultaneously. American bases in Iraq and Syria come under missile attack. The Strait of Hormuz gets mined or threatened. Hezbollah in Lebanon activates against Israel, immediately pulling America's closest regional ally into a multi-front conflict. Houthi forces in Yemen intensify their operations against commercial shipping in the Red Sea, which they are already doing at a level that is causing serious disruption to global trade. And that is the optimistic scenario, the one where nothing goes catastrophically wrong and no one makes a miscalculation that spirals the entire situation into something that looks less like a contained strike and more like a regional war. The Navy officers who are reportedly refusing or slowing rolling certain operational preparations are not doing so because they are cowards. Let me be absolutely clear about that. These are people who signed up voluntarily to serve in the most powerful Navy in human history. These are people who have often spent decades of their lives in service. The ones raising objections are doing so because they have done the strategic calculus, they have war gamed the scenarios, they have looked at the intelligence assessments, and they have concluded that what is being asked of them is not a mission with a coherent strategic objective. It is a political performance designed to satisfy a domestic political audience. And the price of that performance would be paid in the lives of their sailors and in the long-term strategic damage to American power in the region and globally. And this brings us to the deeper issue, the one that goes beneath the immediate crisis and touches on something fundamental about what is happening to American power in the world right now. Because what we are witnessing with the Navy resistance and the Iran policy collapse is not just a story about one administration's foreign policy failures. It is a story about the structural contradictions of American empire in the 21st century. The United States built its post-World War II global dominance on a particular foundation, A combination of overwhelming military power, unmatched economic productivity, the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and a network of alliances and institutions that gave American leadership a veneer of multilateral legitimacy. That foundation has been eroding for decades, and the erosion has been accelerating. And the way you can tell that the foundation is eroding is precisely in moments like this one, when the military instrument, which is supposed to be the ultimate guarantor of American power, starts showing internal fractures. When soldiers and sailors begin to question not just the legality, but the basic strategic rationality of the orders they are being given, that is not a discipline problem. That is an institutional crisis. And institutional crises in militaries do not come from nowhere. They come from a breakdown in the social contract between the political leadership and the military institution, a breakdown in the shared understanding of what the military is for, what it is willing to do, and what it refuses to do. The American military has been through this before. Vietnam was the last time it happened at this scale, and the aftermath of Vietnam produced a military that was deeply reluctant for an entire generation to commit to large-scale ground wars in complex political environments. That reluctance was called the Powell Doctrine, the idea that you only use military force when you have a clear political objective, overwhelming force to achieve it, a viable exit strategy, and genuine public support. The Powell Doctrine has been systematically dismantled over the past 2 decades of endless war in the greater Middle East. And now the chickens, as the saying goes, are coming home to roost. Let's talk about what Iran actually represents in the geopolitical context, because understanding that is essential to understanding why the military professionals are so alarmed. Iran is not just a country that Washington has had a complicated relationship with since 1979. Iran sits at the intersection of 3 of the most consequential geopolitical processes that are reshaping the world right now. First, the realignment of the global South away from American-dominated institutions toward a more multipolar framework. Iran was admitted to the BRICS grouping: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now several others, which represents a significant symbolic and practical shift in global economic architecture. When America bombs Iran, it is not just bombing Iran. It is sending a message to every country in the global South that is currently watching to see whether American power remains the dominant organizing force in international affairs, or whether a genuine alternative is emerging. And that message will not be received the way Washington intends it to be received. Second, Iran is deeply integrated into the Chinese strategic framework at this point. The China-Iran Comprehensive Partnership Agreement, signed in 2021, represents a 25-year commitment of Chinese investment and strategic cooperation with Tehran. China is Iran's largest oil customer. China is Iran's primary economic lifeline in the face of American sanctions. When you attack Iran, you are attacking a strategic partner of the country that is the primary geopolitical competitor of the United States. You are doing it in a context where China is already watching American policy in Taiwan with extreme vigilance. You are essentially forcing Beijing to make a choice about how it responds to the violation of a country it has explicitly partnered with. This is not a scenario that the American military's most serious strategic thinkers are sanguine about. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the immediate American domestic situation, any military action against Iran happens in a context of profound American economic vulnerability. The federal debt is at a level that would have been considered absolutely unthinkable even 20 years ago. The American consumer is stretched, with credit card debt at record highs, savings rates anemic, and a housing market that has frozen out an entire generation of working and middle-class people from home ownership. An oil price shock driven by a Gulf War coming on top of the existing inflationary pressures would be devastating to ordinary American households. And this is something that the people inside the military understand, even if the political decision makers seem disconnected from it. Wars have economic costs. Those costs fall disproportionately on working people, and working people in America are already carrying a burden that is heavier than it has been in a very long time. Now, some people watching this will push back and say, but isn't this what military people are supposed to do? Aren't they supposed to follow orders regardless of their personal strategic or political assessments? And this is a genuinely important question, and it deserves a serious answer. The answer is yes, within limits. The Uniform Code of Military Justice requires obedience to lawful orders from superiors. The operative word is lawful. Military officers have both the legal right and the professional obligation to refuse orders that they believe to be unlawful, and that includes orders that they believe would constitute war crimes or violations of international law. Furthermore, beyond the question of legality, there is a long and distinguished tradition in the American military of officers raising formal dissent through appropriate channels when they believe a planned operation lacks a coherent strategic rationale or poses disproportionate risks. This is not insubordination. This is exactly how a professional, institutionally healthy military is supposed to function. The problem is when that dissent is ignored, suppressed, or punished, which is reportedly exactly what is happening in this case. And this gets to the really dark core of what this situation reveals about the current state of American democratic governance. Because if military professionals are raising objections through appropriate channels, and those objections are being dismissed without substantive engagement, if officers are being pressured or threatened for raising legitimate strategic concerns, then what you have is not a functioning civil-military relationship. What you have is a political leadership that is using the military as an instrument of domestic political theater without genuine concern for either the strategic outcome or the welfare of the people being ordered into harm's way. And that, historically, is a very dangerous place for any nation to find itself. Let's also be honest about the domestic political logic driving this Iran escalation, because ignoring it would be intellectually dishonest. The Trump administration has consistently used foreign policy confrontation as a mechanism for managing domestic political attention. When the economic news is bad, when the polling numbers are sliding, when the domestic political situation is complicated, the pattern across many administrations, but particularly this one, is to reach for the foreign policy lever, create a crisis abroad, or escalate an existing one, and suddenly the conversation shifts from the domestic failures to the foreign threat. The rallying around the flag effect is a real psychological and political phenomenon. It works, at least in the short term, and there is every reason to believe that the Iran escalation is at least partly driven by this logic. The problem is that this time the military is not playing along in the way it has in previous cycles. This time the institutional resistance is visible enough and substantive enough that it is itself becoming a story, which means the political management strategy is backfiring. The implications of this, if the resistance continues and deepens, are genuinely historic. The last time the American military substantially pushed back against political leadership on a major strategic commitment, it changed the course of American foreign policy for a generation. What is happening now may not be at that scale yet, but the trajectory matters. The fact that it is happening at all, the fact that it is happening around Iran specifically, a country and a conflict that every serious strategic analyst understands would be catastrophically destabilizing. The fact that it is happening in the context of a broader global realignment that is systematically reducing American leverage in every region of the world simultaneously. All of this adds up to something that is worth paying very close attention to. Because at the end of the day, this is a story about power, what it is, where it comes from, how it is maintained, and what happens when the institutions that are supposed to project it start questioning whether the people directing it actually understand what they are doing. The United States is at a genuine historical inflection point. The unipolar moment, that brief, extraordinary period after the end of the Cold War when America stood alone as the world's unchallenged superpower, that moment is over. It has been over for a while, but the political class has been extraordinarily reluctant to internalize that reality and adapt American strategy to it. The military, perhaps because it lives and dies by strategic reality in a way that politicians do not, seems to be reaching this internalization faster. And the collision between a political class that still thinks it is living in 1995 and a military that knows it is living in 2025 is exactly what you are seeing play out right now. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. The administration could back down from the most aggressive elements of its Iran posture, claiming some kind of negotiating victory and de escalating. This is actually the most strategically rational outcome, and there are people inside the administration who understand this. Or the political pressure to appear strong could override the strategic, rational voices, and we could see an escalation that goes badly wrong in ways that are very hard to predict in advance. Or, and this is the scenario that should concern every American who cares about the health of democratic institutions, the administration could double down on the confrontation with its own military leadership, attempting to purge the dissenters and replace them with more compliant figures. That path leads somewhere very dark. The history of nations where political leaders systematically subordinate professional military judgment to political loyalty is not an encouraging one. What you, the American people, need to understand is that you have a stake in this that goes beyond the geopolitics of the Persian Gulf. You have a stake in whether the principle that military leadership can and should provide honest professional advice to political leadership, even when that advice is unwelcome, survives this moment. You have a stake in whether the tradition of civilian oversight of the military means civilian leaders listening seriously to military professionals, or whether it degrades into civilian leaders using the military as a prop for political theater while dismissing the people inside it who raise their hands and say, "This does not make sense. This will not end well. There is a better way." The sailors on those ships in the Gulf are not abstractions. They are people's children, people's parents, people's spouses. They deserve leadership that takes their lives seriously enough to have a real strategy before sending them into harm's way. And the fact that credible reports suggest that many of the military professionals responsible for planning and executing any potential action against Iran do not believe that such a strategy currently exists. That should alarm every single one of us, regardless of where we sit on the political spectrum. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a left versus right issue. This is an issue about whether the United States of America is capable of making serious, rational, strategically coherent decisions about the use of military force, or whether the extraordinary power concentrated in the executive branch has now become so disconnected from institutional checks and professional expertise that it constitutes a danger not just to America's adversaries, but to America itself. The Navy is trying to tell us something. The question is whether we are listening.